All right, if you have your Bibles with you this morning, go ahead and turn to Numbers 13. If you don't, it'll be up on the screen. If your eyesight is bad, I suggest you bring your own Bibles, because there's only so big that I can get the words on the screen. So I made them a little bigger this week just to help, but just saying, they print them. They're out there. You can bring one. It's okay. We're in Numbers. You probably thought we'd never get to Numbers. But here we are, Numbers 13, verses 25 through 33. After exploring the land for 40 days, then the men returned to Moses, Aaron, and the whole community of Israel at Kadesh, in the wilderness of Paran. They reported to the whole community what they had seen and showed them the fruit that they had taken from the land. This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is the kind of fruit it produces. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. "Let's go at once to take the land," he said. "We certainly can conquer it." But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. "We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are." So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. "The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too." It's an interesting story. And I think there's a lesson to be learned from it today. As we jump back into our series on character, I know we were judges last week, but I had to put that off for 2 weeks because it was kind of a controversial topic, and we needed to kind of not do that on Father's Day, and Ed was here, and so we picked up the edge of Judges. And if you're at all confused of how we're swinging around, we're back into our series that we started with Ruth about character, in particular godly character, and why godly character matters more today than it has in any other time in history. The bottom line is that we live in a world now that is driven by clicks and sound bites. Oftentimes, the larger context is discarded in view of an edited clip of our heroes and villains. We just finished the Judges, and if we learned anything from the book of Judges and the time we spent there, it's that when a society forgets God and instead does whatever that they think is right in their own eyes, it leads to the utter destruction and disaster in that society. You don't have to be a Bible scholar to see the parallels between the days of the Judges and the culture that we live in today. That's why real, godly character matters. Because people are inundated with the noise. They've grown accustomed to politicians throwing around buzzwords like integrity and commitment, and then never living up to the hype. People are desperate to know if God is real. That's the bottom line. People are desperate to know if God is real, if there's a greater purpose for their life, and if death is not the final end. We need to stop talking about godly character and start living it. We can't hold to simply having the correct beliefs while the people around us are dying on the vine. In order to do this, we have to first recognize what godly character even looks like, so that we can emulate it. Then we partner with the Holy Spirit as believers, and He begins those internal changes within our hearts and souls. We talked about devotion when we talked about Ruth, and today we're talking about Caleb, one of the 12 spies that were sent into the Promised Land by Moses. They scouted it out. And most people who are familiar with with Caleb's story, kind of would immediately attribute the fact that his great character trait wasn't was something like courage. Like everybody else said it couldn't be done, and Caleb believed it could, and that's courage in the face of what looked like utter defeat. Or they might say, well, he had faith. He believed God would be there. That's the man of faith, willing to take a risk, trusting in God. I would offer you this. Caleb's great character strength wasn't courage or faith. Caleb's great character strength was that he was a realist. He was a realist. Now, that word gets tossed about a lot nowadays. Usually when people say they're realist, what they're saying is they don't consider themselves to either be optimists or pessimists, so they call themselves realists. What they mean is actually, they're not realists, they're pragmatists. And what that means is they just do whatever works best. Whether it's a positive or negative doesn't make the difference. What matters is, does it work? It's not a bad way to approach things, but it's not what a realist is. I'm talking about something more than that. I'm talking about someone who is so rooted in the reality of God that it changes their perspective on the world and the challenges that they face. It is because Caleb sees a reality rooted in God that he is courageous or has faith in the first place. Now compare that to the world we live in today. Ask yourself, how rooted in reality are we? My son showed me this clip I'm going to share with you here in a second. And I thought, not only is this hilarious, but this proves the point I'm trying to make about what happens when societies lose grip on reality. I want to make this disclaimer. This is satire. This is not taking a political position. I believe firmly that both political parties in this country should be firmly rooted in reality. I think that's pretty fair. So how do we reclaim reality in the culture that we live in? Where do we start? And I think what we have to do is take a look at Caleb's story in order to understand and find out. So let's dive into that. Moses has successfully led the people of Israel out of captivity from what was at the time the dominant world superpower on the planet. We need to understand that. The Egyptian Empire was the dominant world superpower on the planet, and a bunch of slaves just left. In an honor and shame-based culture like the Middle East, that is a massive slap in the face. It proves who the stronger people were, despite what the perception was. So they go and they wander around in the wilderness, which has its own stories, eating manna and quail, until they come to the edge of the promised land, the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised to Abraham, that had started him on the journey that we read about in Genesis that's behind this whole people group. Once there, God tells him to select 12 leaders from the 12 tribes and sends them into Canaan as spies to scout out the land. And what we just read was the report that they gave when they came back. Let's take a look at that report. They confirm the promise of God. What had God promised Abraham and his descendants? That he would give them a land that was bountiful, that was a land flowing with milk and honey. They come back and they confirm what God said is true. It is indeed abundant. In fact, it's right before this, it says that they cut a cluster of grapes that was so large they had to get a pole and 2 men carrying it between them in order to haul it back. That's a big cluster of grapes. Right? Now think of what that would have looked like to a people that had been wandering around for years in the desert eating nothing but manna and quail. How long do you think those grapes lasted? Like this is heaven for them. They've been eating manna and quail. They've been living before that as slaves in Egypt, living off whatever scraps the Egyptians gave them. And here is the promise of God fulfilled in a land that is so abundant it takes 2 men to carry home the grapes. This is heaven on earth for these people. And you'd think that that would be enough for them. But remember who we're talking about here. This is Israel, after all. It's not enough. They say, yes, it's just like God promised, but. Right? We know when we're talking to people, whenever they say something and they follow it up with but, what they just said doesn't count. The only thing that matters is what comes after the but. Right? I love that new dress, but you don't love the dress. Not if you said but. Right? Just don't say anything. What your mama taught you. I have learned that lesson the hard way. He said, but the people are strong, their cities are large and fortified, and as if to top it all off, the Anakim live there. Well, who are the Anakim? They were the descendants of Anak, and they were said to be giants and ferocious warriors. Goliath was said to be a descendant of Anak. He was Anakim. And they come back and they say, we have a real problem. It's full of giants. And they're violent. It's the Anakim. Now you have to stop right there and say, wait a minute. Did God say to take the promised land, but only if there were no giants in it? Did the God who crushed the most powerful nation on earth to free Israel not say that he would be with you when you entered the promised land? Is his presence not carried around in the tabernacle? Did he not say that he would give you victory over the people that inhabited the promised land, including giants? I mean, did he need to, line item that one out? Here's the irony. Get the irony of this story. All the people in the land of Canaan that he lists, the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Amalekites, they're all vassals of Egypt at this time. They're proxies of Egypt. The nation that just crushed the world's greatest superpower is on their doorstep, and the Israelites are the ones who are afraid. Is that not rich? Ask yourself, considering the circumstances that have just occurred over the last several years in the world at this time, who should be more afraid? These scattered tribes with their giants, or the 1 million people who just decimated the Egyptian empire? This is where Caleb comes in. He doesn't disagree with the report. He doesn't call it fake news. He simply doesn't care. It doesn't matter. He basically tells the people, look, they're just giants. What's the problem? Have you not seen the God who led us as a pillar of fire in the desert all these years? Guys, they're just giants. Where would such a radical take on this report come from? Who would look at a ragtag band of Israelites and think they were a match for giants living in fortified cities? But Caleb knows that Israel can take them because the God who spoke the universe into being, the one who rained down plagues on the Egyptians, is with them. He told them to do it and that they would be victorious. For Caleb, that's the bottom line. That's the reality that he lives in. And when you live in the reality of God, your perception on things changes. Everybody else is not living in the reality of God. They come back with a report that says they're too much for us, they're too big. Where are they supposed to go? Back to Egypt? They actually suggest that, by the way. Maybe we should just go back to Egypt. I'm sure that would be a warm welcome. Where are they supposed to go? They are not rooted in reality. They have witnessed the miracles of God for an entire generation, and when they get to the promised land, they no longer believe that God is really with them. Something has changed. And now they live in fear because the promised land is not as inviting as it once appeared. When you do the math and then you exclude God from the math, you're going to come up with the wrong answer. When you look at reality and you exclude God from reality, the one who is the source of reality, think about that. When you exclude him from whatever solution or problem you're dealing with, you're going to come up with the wrong answer because you're not dealing with reality anymore. Your perception is off. You're living in VR. The truth is this, that we all have a perception of reality, and that perception may or may not line up to reality itself. Too many times, and I see this in our culture, I see this as I talk to people around me, there's this idea that somehow we can bend reality to our will and to our desires and to our values. And we try to do that. We try to deny reality and bend things and say, no, this is what's real in my life. You can have a different reality in your life, but in my life, what they're saying is, this is my perception. You can have a different perception of reality, and they're right. People do. But reality is reality. It doesn't change based on your whims. You conform to reality, not the other way around. It's only how it's always been. Here's a quick example about perception and reality. I was convinced the other day that Aiden had been stealing my guitar picks when he came home because I ran out of picks, and I never run out of picks. That was my perception, and I acted on it. What I learned in my investigation was that my perception was wrong. It wasn't real. I was leaving picks in my pants pockets after church, and then they were going through the laundry, and we were losing them in the laundry. I know that because my wife gave me a huge stash of picks that she'd collected from the dryer. Thankfully. Now I have picks again. But we need to recognize that we live in a society where the learned and elite have rejected the very idea of God. I mean, consider that for a moment, where the smartest and brightest among us start by their starting point in their thought process is the denial that God's even real. And then they work from there. They have removed God from the equation when it comes to reality, and so they're basing their perception of the world and of themselves in a way that isn't based on reality at all. The irony, I think, is that we live in a society where we are told that we are the crazy ones for believing in something as non-existent as the tooth fairy. And people say that so confidently. I spend too much time, actually, on message boards on my news app, but I run into so many interesting people. And they will say these things to me as if it's just a given. Like, well, Christians just... You guys are all crazy. You just believe in the tooth fairy. God's not any more real than the tooth fairy. Okay? So while we're taking a look at the character of what it means to be a true realist, I want to give you a little ammo. Give you something to build your faith in the face of those who would deny reality in favor of their own particular version of unreality. As many of you know, I know I've shared this before, there was a time in my life in college where I went through what I call my atheism phase. And it was a period of my life where I had grown up kind of in the church, not really in a Christian home, but was a big youth group kid and went to a Christian college and was studying for youth ministry. And while I was there, my sophomore year, my whole world fell out. I lost my faith completely. I became one of those people that are deconstructionists. I was really good at breaking things apart, not really good at rebuilding anything. And so as my faith began to be deconstructed, I had nothing to replace it with. And I looked at the other religions around the world, and I tried to find my way back to God, if there even was a God. I was a reluctant atheist. Here's what I have come to believe are the three most compelling and reasonable arguments for the very existence of God. And now I'm laying these out today, and I'm going to lay out all three. I'm going to start with the one that I consider to be, of the three, the least convincing, and they're all really convincing. But of the three, this is kind of number three. Okay, number three, as far as evidence for the existence of God, is creation. Scripture says that the heavens declare the glory of God. And they didn't have a Hubble. Have you seen the pictures from the Hubble telescope? And people think God is not an artist? When you consider how radically fine-tuned our world is, much less the entire universe, it resembles the work of a master engineer or artist. What it doesn't resemble is a chaotic and unplanned event that occurred and then just happened to align itself in such an ordered state that that entire ecosystems developed. Creation shouts the praise of the one who designed it. Take, for example, the lowly honeybee. I know we hear a lot about bees nowadays. I know farmers, you guys rely heavily on the bees, and the declining bee population is a serious concern. But consider just the simple honeybee. If all of this is just some byproduct of some random explosion that happened billions of years ago. That 16-ounce honey bear in your pantry exists only because tens of thousands of bees flew some 112,000 miles in a relentless, unquestioned pursuit of nectar, gathered from 4.5 million flowers. No wonder honey is so expensive. Every one of those foraging bees was female. By the time the life of each ended, they live all of 6 weeks during honey-making season. Each bee flew about 500 miles in 20 days. The span each lived outside of the hive. As these bees were flying themselves to death, the production inside the hive continued with stupendous efficiency. In the following sequence, bee brings nectar to hive, carried tidily in her honey stomach. Bee is greeted, cheerfully one suspects, by a younger homebody receiver bee who relieves her of her load. The receiver bee deposits nectar into a cell and proceeds to reduce its water content and raise its sugar level by fanning it with her wings and regurgitating it up to 200 times, killing microbes along the way. More bees surround this cell and others nearby and fan them with their wings 25,000 times or so, thus turning nectar into honey. When the honey is ripened, wax specialists arrive to cap off the cells, and that is how every single ounce of every single honey pot, bottle, or jar in the world, hundreds of thousands of them, is brought into being. Every gulp of raw honey is a distinct, unique, unadulterated medley of plant flavor, a sweet, condensed garden in your mouth, writes Holly Bishop, an odd amateur beekeeper trying her best with ordinary English to capture a miracle. Do you think the bees were just hanging around one day and thought to themselves, how can we store food to get us through the winter? Do you think there was this one really super smart bee that suggested that they eat something and then throw it up 200 times as a way to preserve it? Wonder how that idea went over the first time. Seems like a reasonable question a commune of bees might ask, right? Who taught them to communicate and build entire hives of bees in the first place? Was it the same bee that invented honey that invented the hive theory? I gotta meet this guy. That's one smart bee. It's laughable and it's ludicrous to believe whole hog by many in our world, in the same way as many in our world, that this is something that came from chaos. But somehow bees just got really smart. The universe is not chaotic, it's ordered. There was a designer. And it's clear when you read the designs. The second, I think, most compelling case for God is the idea of cause. And you say, well, what's that? What we know from watching our world is that for every action, there is a reaction, right? For every cause, there is an effect. However, when the modern world looks at God, they seem to ignore this very basic principle. We know that matter is not formed from nothing. Think about that. Where did all the matter in the universe come from? We can chart where it's going. We can see its movement. We can measure it. We can guess as to how it all started, but no one even begins to guess at how it got there in the first place. Because here's what we know for a fact, scientifically proven over and over again. Matter doesn't just appear. That defies all laws of nature and science. It can change forms, but it never is created or destroyed. Matter is permanent. Somewhere in the beginning of it all is an uncaused cause that starts this chain reaction of events and effects. Something that wasn't a byproduct of something else. God wasn't born, in other words. If you go, well, God was born. Okay, by who? Who gave birth to God? Gaia? I mean, it makes zero sense. Because then you'd say, well, then that's not really God. Somebody gave birth to God. Somebody created God. So God has a creator. So who's the creator God that created God? Like you can keep pushing that back, and what you end up with is 1,000 gods that created God. It's ridiculous. At the beginning, there had to be something uncreated that simply was in order for like everything we know to make sense. And to deny that is to deny basic reality that cause and effect even exist, which we know is ridiculous. It's like the old problem of the chicken and the egg. You know this one, right? What came first, the chicken or the egg? This is not a problem. It's really easy. The chicken. An egg is not a chicken. It's just an egg until it's fertilized. And then it becomes a chicken embryo. We know this. So if you create an egg, that's what you got. Until you fertilize it. Well, how did you fertilize it? Kind of need a chicken. Right? We cracked it. The oldest logical problem in history. You have to have a chicken. There had to be a chicken created first. Logically. Right? Somewhere in creation is the uncaused cause. The one who starts everything into motion, and I would argue keeps it in motion. All right. The singularly most convincing argument for God, in my opinion, is this. Consciousness. The fact that sitting there in your chair right now, you have a sense of being. That you know who you are. You have an identity. You think about things in life and with the people around you. You're aware. You're self-aware. How? Exactly, by the way. How? I read the greatest brain surgeons on the planet, the people who study the human brain more than anyone in the world, have zero idea how consciousness works. How can inanimate gray matter, just kind of doing its thing, all of a sudden become self-aware? I mean, how many billions of dollars are we pouring into computers to get them to become self-aware, which just seems like a ridiculous idea. Like doomsday stuff, but we're trying. Got to give it to us for trying. But how does consciousness work? How do you have a soul? And when I say soul, I mean that thing that transcends this. Our bodies age, they grow, but yet who we are is who we are. How does that work if we all just came from single-celled, unaware amoeba? At what point in evolution did we make the jump from unaware to self-aware? And how exactly would that work? Is there a chromosome or something that needs to happen for us to be it's magic. It's magic. We don't have a clue why we're self-aware. If the dolphins are smart, we know this, dolphins are smart, why don't they organize communes and societies and work together to preserve the oceans? Because they're not self-aware? Because they have no consciousness? They're really smart animals? Dogs are really smart animals. Most dogs are really smart animals. We love them. We build bonds with them that defy just a human-animal bond. Dogs are not self-conscious. They don't start just talking. They've got the buttons now, though, where you can, do that. They'll talk for you, the dog. That's kind of cool. Genesis says that God created man in his own image, meaning God gave man consciousness and the ability to interact with and connect with God and one another. The ability to think, to reason, to produce art and music, not to fulfill some evolutionary task, but simply for the joy of it. How is it possible, if there is no God, that you are self-aware, that you have a soul? Caleb's great strength was that he lived in the world of reality. God's reality, the ultimate true reality. By seeing the world from that perspective, he demonstrates great faith and courage to the others. But it's because of how he views the world. It's because of his perception, an accurate perception, that the rest of his countrymen didn't share. So how does the story end? Well, the 10 spies with the bad report spin up the rumor mill, and they rile up the people against God and against Moses. And they start forming a coup, and they actually try to stone Caleb and Joshua to death for their not joining in this bad reporting, basically. Not joining in their false reality. They even start talking about heading back to Egypt. And all of this comes to a head, this coup, this revolution in the works, comes to an abrupt end, it says, when the presence of God shows up in the tabernacle. That'll put an end to a lot of arguments. Whoa, what's that? Oh, it's the tabernacle on fire. We should probably check it out. And God speaks to the people, and he's disgusted. He wants to end them. Moses talks him out of it. And instead, God says, this generation will never set foot in the land that I promised their forefathers. They'll live out their days wandering around pointlessly with no purpose in the desert other than staving off death for one more day. That was the point of their lives from this point forward. Their children will live to see the promised land. Their children will live to enter in. And oh, by the way, so will Caleb and Joshua, as a reward for their faithfulness and their grip on reality. Let me ask you, what are you dealing with in your life right now? What challenge are you facing? What giant lives there? And then let me ask you this, and this isn't a guilt trip, it's just a question. How would your perception of it change if you saw it through the lens of God's reality, whatever it is? How would how you perceive that thing change? if you saw it in light of God's reality and not the one that you're forming. Because I have a sneaking suspicion your response will look a lot more like Caleb's if you're grounded in the reality of God. Amen?